It looked very different from what I remember.
Hello, sir.
Hi.
How are you?
Good to see you, Arun. Now, you're on somebody else's computer, probably?
No, I'm on my own.
Oh, somebody named Stuart Dixon was using your account, unless that's your pseudonym.
Oh, that's showing up?
Yes,
Let me change the name.
yes, sure.
Uh, um, um, how do you change? Hello. Um,
Jana, you made it.
It works. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Uh, Arun's just fixing his screen name. Yeah, so you tried Google Meet, and then it just brought you to a different video chat, right?
It hooked very easily, but it was leaving me with the impression from the email link that I could just use Google Meet to come into a Zoom meeting, which I didn't realize you could do. Apparently you can't.
I think what happens is that, when you invite by Google Calendars, it always gives you that option. It doesn't like recognize that you actually have another link for Zoom, and so it always gives you that option, like kind of like an option for if you had used it for an in-person meeting, but then there's some people who couldn't physically be there, so they would give you that option. So
almost like it's tempting you over, right?
Yeah, because that's their product. They want to keep you in their ecosystem. Yeah. So we're still waiting for Dr. Stephen.
well, thank you very much for making time on a Friday. It's very impressive. You guys are just unbelievable. Lawrence, you're going to change the world. I could see all the postings you have.
Or just annoy everybody. But yeah, one of those two will happen. One of those two.
Well, when you're annoying people, you're on the right track,
I don't know. Yeah.
I'm very happy. Slowly and surely, I'm learning a little bit about Zoom. There's some very, very good classes if you're ever interested.
Oh.
Zoom has these sessions, 45-minute session, basic, advanced. Oh, fabulously done,
Wow,
So
where did you find them? They're actually from Zoom, the Zoom company itself.
Just on Zoom website.
Oh.
Yeah, and they're obviously they're doing very well. So they want people to learn, and it's unbelievable what they have, and simple things make life that much easy.
Mm.
And it's all PDF and this and that,
Hello, Cirisse. Hi, Dr. Stephen. Yeah, so I think welcome to this FTS in the Zoom podcast. I think introductions are in order. I think that would be a great way to start. Why don't we start with you, Cirisse? You just jumped on, so.
Sure, happy to. And is it okay? I do have some earphones I can plug in here, but if you can hear me fine, I'll use them. Any preference?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, awesome. Hi, everyone. My name is Cirisse Stephen. I am a first-year resident in psychiatry based out of Victoria. Did my medical training in UBC in the Northern Medical Program, and my third year in Cirisse, so a small community in the Northwest, where I did some integrated community clerkship instead of a kind of a different approach to the traditional clerkship. Yeah, very happy to be here. Nice to see you. Nice to see you again, Lawrence, and meet our other folk here.
Chrissy, are you a UBC grad?
Yes, Cirisse, an UBC grad. Mm-hmm.
One interesting time to be a trainee in the middle of the pandemic. Is it impacting psychiatry quite a bit to train in this environment?
So do you mean like it's the training program itself affected, or like the type of? Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I think a lot of people have rallied to doing video conferencing. I know there's a lot of, so I should preface this by saying as a first year resident in psychiatry or a Royal College specialty, we do what we call an off service year. So we're actually all over the hospital, inpatient, outpatient, across many different services and rotate every 4 weeks. So I'm just finishing a block of Psych Emerge, and yeah, and I'm starting a community psychiatry block on Monday. So I'll be able to let you know from a video conferencing point of view if it's affected. Right now in the Psych Emerge, we're still seeing everybody in person. But yeah, in some of the other services, I think there's been like changes to how our residency is being done. You know, a lot of the outpatient specialist clinics are closed or moving to remote format. So a lot of residents are being redeployed to more inpatient consults, which perhaps, you know, reduces some of the breadth of experience we get. But I think that the patient care and the quality of preceptor teaching that we're getting is still the same. Yeah.
That's great. Jana, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Jana Bulmann, and I guess for the purposes of this podcast, I would identify as a patient and caregiver advocate. In a more general context, but my history in that regard has started out in relation to my primary disease community, which is alopecia areata, the autoimmune community, and then has moved into various realms, including mental health and also medical assistance in dying, which my husband received in 2017.
Thank you, Jana.
Sorry, Jana, I didn't get your last name. How do you spell that?
Sure, yeah, I didn't put it up. My last name is Bulmann. It's B as in Bob, UHLMANN.
Bulmann. Okay, I would not have guessed that. Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
I'm a family doctor in Surrey, British Columbia, and I just like having conversations that are inspiring. And Arun, Dr. Garg actually called me about 2 weeks ago and said he would love to have this conversation, and it really resonated with me. And Dr. Garg, I'll let you introduce yourself and introduce kind of what some of your ideas were about this.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you very much, and a special appreciation to Lawrence for making this happen. So my name is Arun Garg, as spelled there, and I am a specialist in laboratory medicine and pathology. I suppose one of these guys who just don't disappear. I've been around for eons, a graduate of UBC 1977, just turned 75 this January, and 40 years of active consulting practice. And as an introduction, I would say that my energy is higher than it was few years ago. Like, I don't feel any different. So this idea of burnout and all the illusions and delusion of medical practice, I just don't see it. So that's I'm still very active, though I've given up my practice at Royal Columbian Hospital or Cody Group, but I'm still very active. And over the last 10 years in my journey, I've been really, though I'm if you want to think of subspecialty or specialties, I would think it'll be like a subspecialty. But my thinking, and most of it is because of my background and my heritage, who I am, is very integrative. So last 10 years, I've been very much involved in our medical system, and I'm a very strong believer in our publicly funded medical system. However, I have a lot of worries and concerns that it's not sustainable. So in that context, the thing which keeps coming at me is gaps. Like, what are the gaps? So which are in the system and how we could address. And with Lauren's interest in quality, and for the last 10 years, my interest has been in population health and public health and the chronic diseases and the gaps in community care. So that has been one of the drivers. So I approached Lawrence and say, could we talk in terms of quality and gaps and more at the level of thinking, because if our thinking is right, then you can find solutions. And obviously, I feel that in our search for technology and application of technology, we are becoming very much more insular and reductive. So those gaps in care are showing up everywhere. And so I just thought we would like to have that conversation and and see if there is so then Lauren suggested he knows two other people, Jana and Cirisse, so that's how he brought us all together.
Yeah, I was, Jana is a prolific patient voice, and Cirisse is uh, one of the amazing trainees that I've met throughout my career. So, yeah, really happy they could join us. What really stuck out from that conversation with you, Arun, is that you identified that if we have a more integrated system, we kind of link a few of the silos that we have in our system together, we can gain some efficiencies and maybe some efficacy, and that we're under leveraging a lot of the resources in our community. I'm wondering, Jana, what are some of the gaps that you might see in our system, our health system, that we might be able to link together?
Well, now I see why you invited me, Lawrence, because the word gaps came up. I always identify myself as a gaps and overlaps person. I would say that's just the way my mind works. I in general, I think of myself as a gray zone thinker, which is, it's a bit of an interesting thing to be right now in what I would describe as a very black and white world. There's a lot of fear, and we seem to need to go to extremes in either direction. So it's a strange place to be in. But oh gosh. There are myriad of gaps, are they not? I think, probably the two big ones, if you could describe them as gaps, I think you could, that come to mind immediately for me right now, that staring us all in the face, are long-term care and the support of people with disabilities in the system. Those are huge ones. As an advocate, I've stepped very gently into the long-term care discussion, particularly with a group of loved ones who are on Facebook, and it is overwhelming to hear their stories. I think, particular from a patient perspective, from a patient advocacy perspective, I'm really curious and somewhat baffled why the system, quote unquote, can't seem to get its head around this definition of what an essential partner in care is, the value of having that loved one present. And I think I have a few ideas why that's the case in terms of this time of great fear within the pandemic, but it's having a profound impact on long-term care, as we are hearing about. And I think within the system in general, hearing people's stories about not being able to attend with a parent going into emergency, being left on their own, or someone who would normally need their care. So I think for me, that's probably one of the biggest gaps that is horrific and fascinating at the same time.
Absolutely. Bringing in and recognizing the amazing resource of family caregivers, I think is part of that, what you had mentioned. And I do want to give a plug for BC Family Caregivers, or Family Caregivers of BC. Just Google that, and they have some amazing resources for family caregivers of people with chronic disease, recognizing that 99% of the care is given by the patient themselves or their family caregivers. Cirisse, how about and there, of course, there is no right or wrong answer in this discussion. It's simply speaking authentically about what we've seen in your own journey. What are some of the gaps that you've noticed, Cirisse, in our health system?
Well, so I first think that it's one of perspective. I know, Lawrence, you and I connected back when I was either a first or second year medical student at the IHI National Forum down in Florida. And this was just like looking at systems, identifying silos, trying to come up with creative solutions. At that point, I think it was even before I jumped into learning clinical work as a medical student, and certainly well before residency. And I think that like recognizing our own limitations is like an important part to join any conversation. So what's resonating with me now is, as a first year resident, I would have to say that I think my field of vision or attention has narrowed a lot to like learning the knowledge, being productive, getting used to being in this new role of resident. Whereas as a first year medical student, it was much wider. I was trying to learn. I was just like a I don't know, a developing child learning a language, I'm soaking in everything. My perspective was broader. It's narrowed subsequently over clinical years as a new resident, and I anticipate it would broaden as well. But I think perhaps one of the gaps around that is, having conversations like this where we can connect with people across different levels or different stages, or maybe not even stages, because that suggests a linear progression, but different aspects of care. And I think that this is really powerful because it helps us step back, broaden our vision, and look at what's actually going on. What are our values? Where are we placing our time and emphasis? And it's easy to lose that when you're in the day-to-day, grind of trying to learn or be effective and, providing output. I know it sounds like such a harsh word. Like, what does it mean? It's humans who are trying to provide service. But that's kind of the initial thing that stuck me. And then in terms of, like, Jana, building off what you were saying, as a new resident who's coming into practicing in a clinical environment in the middle of the pandemic, I think my perspective, or one of the gaps that's skewed, is that I wasn't aware of services that were perhaps offered before that are now taken away from the pandemic, such as like restricted access in hospitals. So certainly, like working in the psych emerge, I think perhaps we used to have people who would accompany, loved ones waiting in the room, which can be quite an overstimulating and scary environment for a lot of people who are trying to access mental health services. There's lots of different states of agitation, distress, a variety of like psychoses, mania, suicidal thoughts. So it can be very overwhelming. And right now, a lot of people are coming in and sitting here alone. And, we're doing our best, but I think even just from my point of view, not recognizing what was there before is like a huge gap as well. And where we came from influences often where we go, or at least how we're having conversations, right? So I think that this is an awesome launch pad, and perhaps even something that we can try and do more. And then even just from narrowing my attention even more to a residency program, a lot of the social interactions that come from mixing first, second years, fifth years together, preceptors together is lost. We're doing our work and we're going home, and we're not having those informal opportunities to interact and pose new ideas about even what's possible on the path ahead. Dr. Garg, you were saying like your career's really changed over the years, and you're pursuing new ways of approaching it. And I think one of the things I was looking forward to as a new resident was to interact with people in upper years of the program, particularly in psychiatry, as it's not one of the, like, we get tastes of it in medical school, but it's really such a broad realm and there's lots of different ways to take it. So I feel like my roadmap is a little obscure for what lies ahead. So lots of different gaps there that are coming to mind, but basically all through the last 5 minutes of conversation we've had, which I think is a great indicator that conversations are wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, as a family physician in practice, some of the biggest gaps that I notice are, of course, the ones that come in mental health care. There are gaps in the limitations of what family physicians are actually able to diagnose, and we're really handicapped a lot of the times in how we can treat. Effective pharmacotherapies are not always available for mental health challenges, somatic disorders, and also in terms of when counseling or cognitive behavioral therapy is warranted as one of the modalities of therapy, the patients can't always access those because of costs, and our system doesn't have those funded fully for our patients. So that's a big gap. And many patients I've seen are kind of losing faith in some of the Western medicine approaches. And I call it Western medicine when it's like allopathic therapies or prescription drug therapies, because they actually don't respond to all of them. I guess the phenotypes of all the spectrum of humanity that come into our doors don't always match up with what the randomized controlled studies have actually prepared us. The RCTs have given us this many tools, but then the needs are like quite a bit more. So there are quite a few gaps in our system. And one of the things that really bothers me is when my colleagues feel that the tools in our system are enough, are actually all there is. And if you don't fit in those tools, sorry, you're in a gap, but that gap's not my responsibility. And so there's a conflict between the population and the health system at times. And I think that's one of the big gaps. Do you see some of that, Dr. Garg? Or
Yeah, I think this is uh, one of the foundation when you think of it is what is the root cause of in spite of such an effort about healthy society that we got paralyzed by COVID. I mean, that really brought it out. So I think my own thinking is even more foundational. And if I may share just a little bit of that background for the conversation to come, is if you look at growth and the advances and the discoveries in science, they've been phenomenal. I think as we became more advanced in use of technology and sciences, slowly but surely we lost track of person as a whole. So the whole training started gapping is deeper and deeper probing what is causing the disease and what you may say reductive thinking. So this whole bio thinking is based on subspecialist versus subspecialist versus subspecialist. And in that process, our thinking became very reductive. So the biggest gap I would think is in our foundational thinking of what I call integrative thinking. And I think Jana kind of alluded that to holistic approach to health is the awareness of the family and say in long-term care. However, system became so bureaucratic that we have lost that thread. So I would even submit that the gap is really we have to make use of this COVID as a signal that we need to bring some transformative changes in our thinking about who we are. And that comes from integrative thinking. And I think if we focus on general practice and population health, then you will see what I'm trying to say here. So definitely there is no doubt that last 100 years, so that's all it is, 100 years of progress of science, we have become very insular and very reductive in our approach to health at the expense of holistic approach, of what I call now external and internal interventions. And what I mean by that is that patient or the person has become just a set of symptoms, and what can we do to them to make them feel better? And we are very good at that, what you might call acute care. And that's all internal interventions. Oh, sorry, external interventions. In other words, things which are done to you. What we lost track is internal interventions and empowerment of the individual in their own care. And that's what chronic care is all about, or community care is all about, or long-term care is all about. And I would say that we do so little in that space because whole Medicare came with the diagnostics and hospital care. So the whole emphasis, the training, and everything has been subspecialist, subspecialty, subspecialty. I'm a cardiac, and even in cardiac, I'm an ultrasound guy. I don't know much about intervention or this and that reflects in our how we look at the patients. And that is one of the huge gap which must be kind of brought under the umbrella of quality. So in terms of taking an example, say chronic diseases in community care or in long-term care, everything is now geared towards these episodic visits or intervention which are external. But who is really providing the continuum of internal interventions, family attachments, family relationships, 24/7, 365 care with which you live? And it's creating massive, massive chaos and gaps in care. And I don't think we even talk about it. So this conversation is important in itself. I don't see very many people even talk about it. People talk about continuum of care, comprehensive care, GP office, but it really is the 24/7, 365 internal intervention and empowerment of the individual for their own care, connecting with the family, connecting with the lifestyle, connecting with friends, and how important that is in that care.
Does that resonate, Jana, some of what Dr. Garg is saying?
Oh, huge. Well, I was going to say the people who are talking about it probably the most are patient and caregiver advocates, who say things like, I am the expert in my own care. But what you're saying, Dr. Garg, really resonates, thinking even just of personal experiences within the healthcare system. Having that, I'm a confident voice, but there are many instances where I find myself feeling really meek and silenced. And I'm the one who's silencing myself because I'm very conscious of the system dynamic that I'm in when I move into, and it can be a myriad of different examples within healthcare. So it's interesting, as a parent, trying to impart that empowerment to my child in terms of how they express and represent themselves in healthcare. And of course, when they're with me in healthcare situations related to myself, they may actually be witnessing me succumb to the system in that regard. So I think that's really, really powerful. What you said really resonates with me. One of the things I wrote down is it makes me think about an advocate within our system, particularly on social media, Andy DeLeo, who goes by the tag Cancer Geek. And he loves the hashtag and the concept of N of one, getting us back to that relationship between the patient and the physician. And it's that relationship that puts the humanity back into the service provider, right? The healthcare professional, but also allows the humanity to come up within the patient too. And for me, that was one of many revolutionary thoughts or streams of dialogue that I've engaged with since becoming more involved in as an overt advocate. But I think that really connects with what you're talking about. Yeah, I'm sure could tell a myriad of different stories in that regard.
So the concept of the N of one, where often studies are like N of thousands, and then we kind of lose the individual nature of therapeutic relationships, really, where N of one is kind of counter to that reductionist perspective that Dr. Garg mentioned, where we just reduce people to his symptoms. But a holistic and integrated approach would see the person's whole life. Have you experienced, Jana, where someone in the healthcare system has actually worked on what Dr. Garg calls in the internal, did you call it the internal approach?
Internal, yeah, internal interventions.
Internal interventions.
Yeah, I was looking for some way to explain what I'm thinking, right? So I said, I want to keep away from notion of allopathic or Ayurvedic or Chinese or integrative or complementary. I want to be in 2021 as holistic as I can be of the person, and in context of who we are, in context of nature. So that's my relationship. So in that, external interventions are things which are done to you in terms of health. It's what doctors tell you to do, the pharmacotherapy which is given to you, all those things. But then there is you yourself who has to think of your own health, and that is internal intervention. So that just, I don't know if this kind of terms even exist. I just coined it as I was thinking along. So you just have to kind of, for communications, if nothing else, right? And what I mean by that is, like in Jana's case or in chronic diseases, so for example, diabetes, let's say as an example, diabetes or any chronic disease, blood pressure, high pressure. Biggest thing is promotion of health, which comes from within. So the whole thing around lifestyle and how we live and how we relate to nature very early on. So that is part of internal intervention. Then prevention of the disease. And then in terms of management of the disease, and as physicians, that's where our role is in diabetes, therapeutic modalities, you go and see your doctor, but that's like a 5-minute, 10-minute, 20-minute visit, half an hour visit at a very pre-scheduled time. That's not natural. So what's happening to you between the visits, and that's the gap. And to me, that is all internal interventions. How committed you are to your own health. How do you visualize it? What kind of support you have for it? And then how we support each other during that time to enhance internal interventions. So just using diabetes, how about having capacity and centers whereby families interacting with each other, and it becomes then culturally very effective and efficient because each one is individual, and how we react internal interventions are solely based on our experiences of our culture. And in a diverse society, we need to be aware of that. And you hear this all the time. First Nations, how they feel they're not getting the care they need, and the disease patterns are increasing. South Asian community, of which I am the part, and this is where a lot of it came, the diabetes, 80% of the effort should be in this internal interventions between office visits, whereas it's other way around. 80% of the expenses and interventions are related to that episodic visit, and the rest of the time you're on your own. So that's what I mean by internal interventions, external interventions, gap, care, and integrative thinking, which leads to integrative leadership, which leads to integrative health, and then eventually integrative medicine in that sequence.
Yeah, Dr. Stephen, does have in your training that you are in your R1 year, has this concept come up much at all?
I don't think it's come up in terms of like being presented as a concept to have like a cerebral conversation around, but certainly as all three of you have been talking, there's just been all of these examples that have popped to my mind. So I've just finished 4 weeks in the Psych Emerge, and it's certainly an area where we're very cognizant that there's a power differential between the healthcare providers and the people coming in seeking care, because we have the ability to basically admit people under the Mental Health Act, right? Remove their decision to voluntarily be in hospital. I think if we're to talk about this in terms of like external and internal interventions, one area where things I think can mesh better, not always, but can, is in the family meeting, right? Like we're seeing people come in crisis, and a lot of the time we're realizing we don't have enough information. And so what we're doing is we're engaging our team members, ideally bringing them in, and sometimes we are having like inpatient family meetings, sometimes over the phone, but saying, what's going on? What are they like at home? Like what's different? What are you worried about? And ideally, this isn't just happening with, the partner or the child or the parent. It's actually having together. So we've had a number of times where people come in a situation of crisis, and the question is, are they safe to go home? And so a lot of the mentors I've been working with have said, there's no secrets are toxic here. Let's bring everybody in. Let's have a conversation. Let's have I'll use the word patient, but because that's just the word we're comfortable with, but like say, we'll bring them in, we'll bring your loved ones in, we'll hear what they're worried about, we'll hear what you feel, we'll have an open conversation. I think our roles can be helpful as moderators, especially when things getting heated, as kind of being perhaps the chairperson of the meeting, to say, let's let this person finish. Let's hear them out, kind of summarizing, putting it back and forth. And then ideally, there's a lot of saying, it sounds like everybody's here in their best interest and we want the best possible outcome. So that might be that. And then as our role would be to say, these are the external interventions that we're proposing for this purpose. And we hear like, is it amenable to the patient, to the families? Sometimes it's not, which is where I think the question of, Dr. Garg, you were saying, like, how committed are you to your health? That's certainly a question we have to ask ourselves all the time about our patients, right? We use the terms insight and judgment. How insightful are they to what's going on? How reliable would they be in pursuing things that are in their best interest? And I realize like that assessment is fairly patriarchal, but I think we do it in the patient's best interest. And when it's done right, it's done with the patient and with their family members to say, let's figure something out that lasts, right? And then sometimes it is more acute or short term, but ideally we're saying, what's your environment that you're going back to? What are your supports? What are your goals? What are things we can work on now? And I think that's something that when we have enough time, it can be done right. I was thinking throughout it, I'm like, oh yeah, you know, as a resident, I have a little bit more time. I'm encouraged to explore things, but when I'm staff, have to be a little bit more judicial with my time. And then it's the whole FTS thing, right? Like, why are we thinking in terms of constraining ourselves so far? Because we're essentially establishing these silos. Like, why aren't we thinking outside of what's already being done to how we can do it better? So I'm just a little cognizant of already putting the shackles on about what we can do and being like, oh yeah, we need to step back and be like, what's ideal? And then how can we make that actually happen? Yeah.
I think the experience of medical education is very much like that. You do have to let go and stay open and absorb what's going on around you. Okay, this is how it's done. And then later you start breaking the rules and making your own innovations to improve what you're able to do. I think that was a fantastic anecdote of how in the psych emergency room, you empower patients, you empower their families, and you align everybody in that cultural unit of the family to try to move in a healthy direction together.
And I think a lot of it's about encouraging and empowering better communication through the family units, right? Like there's a lot of times people don't say something because they're worried of offending. And I think part of the real magical thing that we can provide that's longer lasting is, you know, talk to each other, right? Like you both seem to have good intentions here. Let's get this out in the open now and then really encourage this to move forward.
That skill of moderating facilitating real talk is so helpful, not only in patient care, but in the courts, in parenting, in leadership. That's fantastic, Dr. Stephen. Jana, have you had an experience with some type of health care provider, any type, where you felt that they were working in the internal interventions area? Have you had that experience?
Well, I thought it was interesting, Dr. Garg, when you were talking about sort of rising above types of medicine, if we could characterize them that way, because I often think of it in types, which I think you could pose as silos. For me, the first one that comes to mind, and Lawrence has heard me talk about this, is my first experience with naturopathic medicine. Now, obviously acknowledging that this is a private, paid context, I'm paying money for a longer appointment, which means they have more time to sit with me. But in my varied experiences over the years with naturopathic medicine, I've really been struck by a couple of things. One is that dialogue. I do feel like I'm on a level playing field. I do feel like I am the expert in my own body and my own health. So that really struck me. The idea of a first appointment that lasts an hour and a half long, so we can take the kind of history of not just my medical experiences, but the larger context of me. And then my very first experience with naturopathy involved one of the most striking things that I like to talk about, which is this notion of saying, I don't know. I'd never heard a medical practitioner say, I don't know. And my naturopath, who had about 30 years of experience under his belt, so he had that context as well, said that to me, I don't know, but we're going to figure this out together. So let's start that journey. And I was blown away compared to, some of my other experiences with allopathic medicine. So I think for me that opened up a very particular door, but then right there, it created silos, right? Because I see my naturopath in this context and I see my GP. And does my GP want to hear about my naturopath? What happens if I bring up my naturopath? And that's one particular context. If I engage with the modality of Reiki or other alternative modalities, can I talk about that when I'm dealing with my GP or other allopathic contexts? I would say I probably feel more, and Lawrence has heard me talk about these contexts many times, I feel almost more hesitant than ever right now because of the black and white nature of the pandemic, that raising certain contexts, it might place me in silos where I don't actually exist because people need me to live there in order to feel more comfortable based on their heightened fears. So there's a little story for you.
I think what you're saying is that if you admit that you have benefited from Reiki, somebody will call you an anti-masker. That's almost what you're saying. And there is almost a vehement attack from some of my own colleagues in family medicine towards those who sell services like naturopathic services. And I think there's an othering that's occurring, and there's a maybe an intellectual pride as well. In, you know, I'm a Western medicine specialist, and for you to call yourself a doctor, that feels like you're taking something away from me. And those types of almost like turf wars, or almost like, I don't know, high school jealousy kind of issues, are really keeping the silos more and more insulated, and we're not really learning from each other. And many of physicians feel there's nothing to learn. Family physicians that I've spoken to, and that's kind of, it's disheartening to me, because if nothing else, it sounds like naturopathy has developed a model where they're able to actually build trust, or to listen well to the person who's trying to get better.
Well, and it's always dependent on the individual practitioner, right? You know, and I think that's in any context. I think, you know, another really good example would be my experience with midwifery. I only have one child. She was delivered by a midwife. And I think because of the thinking as a gaps and overlaps person, a gray zone kind of mind, I was experiencing her care as well as analyzing it, and found that really fascinating. My particular midwife, who has since passed, had 25 years of experience as an obstetrics nurse before she became a midwife. So she had a particular context. I delivered in hospital, but I asked her questions. I was curious, and she narrated about how long it took for her to be accepted by the delivery teams, the nurses. And I saw that actually in the delivery of my daughter. One of the nurses really pushed for a monitor before my daughter was born. And afterwards, I listened, the tone of my midwife really changed as she almost lectured about, okay, I accommodated your request, but here's why I don't think we actually needed that. So I saw this, she lived, you know, almost in a little silo within the hospital context outside of her experience. And she was very similar to my experience with naturopathy, this notion of, we have a relationship here. You know, we test for this. It's common to test for this right now, but I'm going to give you some space to research it and see how you feel about that. Do you want to engage with this test while you're pregnant or not? There was a real empowerment in there. To the, you know, often when I write about my experience with midwifery, I talk about crying when I left that last appointment and asking her if she could perhaps become my GP, because I didn't want to lose that level of care that we had. It was really, really phenomenal. Visits to the home for a week afterwards, every day, she caught the beginnings of mastitis for me. You know, and I think there's another, you know, I could go off on many different tangents, but there's an interesting one in terms of information or knowledge or evidence that we have lost. I often talk about, you know, as she saw that I was heading down this path of infection, she sent my then husband off to get green cabbage. And we both kind of said, green cabbage. And that green cabbage bag came back home. She's like, now stuff this in your nursing bra and replace it every few hours. Where does that knowledge come from, and how do we talk about that knowledge as evidence, right? And what would my GP say if I brought up that information? We existed in that really protective silo of my midwife with me at home, sharing knowledge that may have in the past, and this talks to that notion of internal intervention, and that knowledge may have come from my aunt or my grandmother in the past, right? That community, that family bond, people may have gathered around me, or the neighbor may have been the person who said, go get her some green cabbage, you know? We've lost many things like that. So I think that notion of internal intervention really resonates with me.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say, obviously the field is so big, and you know, we could go on, and then we might lose the track of what this conversation started. So if I could just bring it back, what I'm thinking is, in terms of health and medical care, in that context, the gap which is there, and how to bring it so that quality can be improved so I think in that focus, acute care, when you are acutely ill, and science has to play and things have to be done. That's a context in its own right, but I'd like to park that. But the thing where I would like to focus is on chronic diseases, or what you will say community care or population health care, and in the realm of well-established pathways. And I feel that there's a gap even there. And if we could address that gap, then maybe society will be healthier. So just using as an example again of diabetes, because even though we're talking about COVID, which has affected 100 million people right now, as we talk, diabetes is affecting 400 million people worldwide. And the quality of life and productivity and life itself is grossly affected this chronic care and the gaps which exist. So I think if we focus on that, that alone can bring the quality better. And the gap I'm talking here is the gap Jana alluded to a little bit, and Chrissy used it beautifully in the emergency example. That that family forum where the conversation takes place is an example of empowerment of the individual and filling that gap. Now, in acute care, it has a different connotation, but in chronic care, it becomes very big. Because diabetes, for example, 20% of the care is in this acute intervention. 80% is in your own environment. And there are no forums, there are no capacities, there are no clinics, there are no places where people can come together. So I visualize for diabetes having a community capacity where you are sharing with all the experts, including dietitians, including physiotherapists, including naturopaths, who are all coming together, sharing this knowledge and empowering the individual to take their care. And that's what I mean by integrative thinking. And that's what I mean by external interventions and internal interventions. So you now empower the person along with family, which has to be, and I have to emphasize that in our thinking, we need to think of the context of culture. In a culture which like ours, which is so diverse, health is very individual, and this is where it comes the notion of epigenetics. So there is a mix of science here, and so what I'm talking about is not just uh, words based on science. As you know, I just became grandpa, and so we were in Toronto, and to my surprise, the place where we stayed, there was a book. Just a coincidence. A book was by Dr. Ho, I think, who is a journal internist in Toronto, and it was all about integrative thinking and technology. And I was really, I thought it was really put here not by, this is not just by accident, this is really my journey which I am on. And here is a doctor writing a whole book on this chronic diseases and the importance of integrative thinking. So I think this is what really conversation I was having with you when I was having from Toronto, which initiated that. I said, oh yes, there is something. Now we could talk about complementary medicine, we could talk about alternate therapies, we could talk about holistic approach, but then the field gets so cumbersome because everybody's self-interest comes in. So I was thinking mostly in the context of chronic diseases and community-based care. And this is where I feel general practice and the addiction and substance abuse and psychiatry and mental, the role of mind. We haven't talked about that. We talk about body, but then the mind, the role plays, and how do you put it all together? And that conversation, where does it take place? In context of health and diabetes as an example, or blood pressure, that's another example, or chronic renal disease, or kidney disease, or depression. That gap exists. I don't know anywhere where this kind of conversation can take place in a safe environment.
I mean,
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, thanks. I'll be quick. I was just, when you talk about where can this conversation take place, I'm also thinking in terms of, like, I like to think in terms of how do we implement these good ideas? And so, like, where does it physically take place as well? What does that look like? I know I just finished recently 4 weeks of addiction medicine and worked at some amazing outpatient clinics where we had social worker, we had a peer support worker with one of the local organizations of people who had addictions and then recovered and are now helping other people. We had a nurse, me as the resident, and we had a doctor, and the 5 of us met together every day, went through the list, met with the patients as they came in. Somebody would be the point person, and then we'd say, oh, I think you need to talk to them today. But it was like this great hub. And I think that they're starting to go that way in terms of some of the integrated clinics, but I'm wondering if anybody thought about other ways that we can actually implement this, like what that actually looks like. I think in the past, I think too about like more equatorial communities versus our northern communities. There's a real difference in terms of how we interact with each other, right? I think in our northern communities, it's cold, it's dark. Like we spend a lot of time in our home, in our office. We sometimes go out, but with COVID, there's no more markets or places where we really go and interact. Whereas a lot of the time, I've had the opportunity to travel to warmer places. There seems to be more life and community happening out on the street. You leave your home, you interact with your neighbors, you meet up places, you call people over, things happen. So I just always wonder in terms of like what we could do to actually make this happen, what it looks like, and if any of you have encounters, ideas, or thought about this.
Well, I think there's one thing that we haven't talked about yet that's really, really critical. It's the thing that we're doing right now. We're engaging virtually, and communities have been doing that for a long, long time. In 2008, when I came on Facebook and discovered the alopecia community, I cried. I thought, if I'd had this opportunity as a 14-year-old girl when I first started to lose my hair, holy cow. Since then, I've gone on to be very engaged with that community. I now manage a tiny little 650 member Alopecia Canada group on Facebook. There's a 20,000 member Alopecia Areata group on Facebook. We take care of each other. There's a Parents of Children with Alopecia group. We bump people over there all the time. There's people who are trying the AIP approach, autoimmune paleo, a dietary approach to alopecia. So I would say that that is an intense internal intervention, but it is also its own kind of silo. We're somewhat protective of who we let into those conversations. And I know I'm not alone. I can think of a friend of mine who was diagnosed in her late 50s, I believe, with diabetes. So to use that example you've already raised, and looking at how she explored as an individual, she wasn't waiting for someone else to empower her. She empowered herself, and how she explored as an individual and how she refined her own healthcare, her own approach to medicine. It was a powerful thing to witness. She really very actively in an empowered fashion created an approach that worked for her, that was a stretched version of what she had originally started with her GP, for sure. So I think that what this online context that the virtual world gives us is incredibly empowering, and it does create communities that we forget about, that we don't talk about, and that do exist in their own little silos, because they are addressing these gaps that we're talking about today. They're just filling those gaps.
Absolutely, great example, wonderful example. And Chris, what you just raised was exactly what going through my mind now. Okay, how do you put it? First of all, define a little bit where the gap is, but more important, how do you fill it? And essentially not to create another level of bureaucracy, or not to create another level of interventions, but make use of existing systems. So I think your alopecia community example is fantastic, because this is, but it'll be very nice if that community was broad enough and felt empowered, that is being supported by all the experts in that field. So my notion, and just using diabetes as an example, is that, so whatever we create is not in isolation, but integrated to the system. So this virtual community or physical community of diabetes 24/7, 365 now is connected to their GP, and GPs knows what's being discussed there. So there is a certain amount of organization, and the drivers are champions themselves, but not driven by self-interest or professional interest or as a hierarchy. So that's how I visualize. So South Asian community, where I've been very interested, because diabetes is 3 or 4 times more prevalent, and most of it is related to ongoing lifestyle and the amount of consumption of sugar and things like those. So I think diabetes, you could create these virtual communities based on where people gather together. And again, you have to be culturally effective. Uh, First Nations have their way of absorbing and reacting and building trust. So we need to work what works for them, what works for that particular community, what works for other communities. In in people of heritage in India, family is very important. The family dynamics is very clannish. So you need to bring that group where there is a trust together to have this conversation.
Mhm.
And similarly, so it's not like a cookie cutter, but my worry or my concern is that in our public healthcare system, we don't have flexibility to have these conversations or create these programs. And this is when I approached Lawrence, was under the banner of quality, can we bring this integrative thinking? So a good example is surgical wait list. If you look at surgical wait list, people talk about OR time, surgical time, but the biggest reason we have these gaps is how bookings are done, how people are, once you make the diagnosis, and I know there is a project going on using what I call pre and post gaps. So that's just one example of quality and intervention in a process in acute care. If you apply that in chronic care, and we have to take small pieces at a time, so make sure it works, then diabetes as an example, or it could be depression or mental health or substance abuse or addiction, where you are still connected to the general practice and group of people coming together, and then there are resources now which they can access. So that's the connotation, Chris, I had, how to put some of that in action.
Cirisse, have you been able to see any type of approach like that in the mental health sphere? Like, I don't know. Like, I think there's a lack of trust from some of the physician side that if you have a forum for patients with mental health disorders, that that it will be, that it'll serve, or that it'll self-organize to improve.
Yeah, I think that there's a couple things. Conversations need to be had. I don't have an answer. I don't even know if I really understand the question.
Why don't you have an answer?
But
Don't you know everything?
But even to have like the conversation, I think there's also like I'm hearing trust. And like Jana, when you gave your example of talking to your doctor about seeing a naturopath, it sounds like you were fearing and being judged, right? Or what would they say? Or would my relationship with them be compromised? Would my care be compromised if I disclose this information? So there was this lack of, like, we could use the word trust, but it's where do I stand? It's unknown, it's fear, it's like all of these different things, right? And I think when we talk about, oh, could we have some broader platform for mental health? I think I want to say yes. I think we can do almost anything we want, but it comes down to like how we actually do it. And I imagine that I think it's like, how do we have the conversation, right? I know we've talked about structures and hierarchies versus flattening and empowering people on the front lines to have those. I think there can also be, I think it comes down to culture too. And I'm kind of talking these nebulous things, but I'll bring it together. And what I mean is, I think there's a cultural of feeling misunderstood. There's a culture of feeling, I don't feel seen, I'm different, I don't know how to communicate, I don't feel understood. And that's across any, in the hospital, out the hospital, it's being human, right? Where do I fit, even within our loved ones? So I think there's a tendency to other as well, to say, oh, I want to engage in this conversation, but I'm different. And then the second part is needing the acknowledgement. It's like, Is acknowledging ourself and ourself enough, or do we need external acknowledgement before we can continue on with the conversation? And some of the things I've observed in mental health is that a lot of people feel, I say mental health, in my, psychiatry experience so far, let's say in the emergency room, and I won't specialize it just Victoria because I've worked in emergency rooms across the province, but people need to feel like you're listening before they trust you to continue the conversation. And I think a lot of the times they're so used to feeling truncated or not understood that there's an unwillingness for them to then listen to you because they don't feel like they've been fully heard yet. So it's like, how do you meet? Is there a willingness of the patient to engage? Is there a willingness of the practitioner to engage? And yeah, it's a cultural thing. Like everybody wants to be different now, to have this special combination of hashtags, or, well, I'm this thing, but with this extra thing. And it's like, if we're going to get caught in those details, how do we bring it back to the core conversation, right? Like Dr. Garg, you were saying, there's so many different ways we can have this conversation, but how do we get back to something that's productive? How can we figure out what it is we want to talk about? And so I think you do need moderators then to engage in any type of broader platform. Probably, I know, Jana, you raised an interesting group about this broad community that seems amazing. And then you said, but we have screeners. We have people who moderate, who joins the conversation and not. And perhaps it's not so much a question of who can join the conversation, but how do we streamline what happens, right? Kind of like the person in the audience with the microphone who goes around and figures out who gets to ask the question next, like something. These are the details that we can figure out if we have enough people in the conversation and can listen. Yeah.
Yeah, well, specifically with groups like that, I think it's essentially peer support, right? And I think what the primary characteristics of peer support is the majority of people come in, get a little bit of information, leave. The people that stay are people who are kind of stuck in loops, right? So I think even in those large groups, you see that. So you see I see it in the smaller group I manage. There's a lot of people that come in. It's the same question over and over again, right? Or people wanting to come in, the snake oil salesmen, as we call them, that really want to take advantage of people. And those are the people we're moderating for. But I think, to jump off what you're saying, to me, trust, like you said that at the beginning, and that trust and relationship, these are the things that we need to feed. And I think the challenge is the primary system that we're talking about, the primary healthcare system within which we all engage, it's not designed for that. It goes back to your original comment, Dr. Garg, in terms of like, I'm a set of symptoms, right? You're working with me as a set of symptoms and you've lost a sense of who I am as a human being. But then what that does in turn is doesn't give the healthcare professional space to be a human being as well, right? You're an expert, I'm a set of systems, there's no relationship here. Where's the opportunity to build trust? And then from there, we've created a system around it. One of the things I struggle with so much, and I'm pretty active on social media, so that's where these conversations usually happen is, and I should also preface, I didn't acknowledge this at the beginning, but I'm a bureaucrat, a federal bureaucrat with 23 years of experience. So I find it really interesting when people say the government or the system. And I always like to bring up, but we are the system. We are the people in government are all citizens. We're all human beings just like you. So to me, that's really empowering. And perhaps I'm a little bit naively optimistic in that regard. But I think if we've created this system that constrains us to the place that you're an expert and I'm some symptoms, and there's not enough time to have these conversations that build trust and relationship, well, okay, great, there it is. Like there's really the starting point. If we want trust and relationship, then we have to push at the system so it doesn't necessarily define us as experts in symptoms. How do we massage the system? How do we massage ourselves so that Lawrence gets to be a person and I get to be a person too, and we can build and have that trust dynamic.
If I may, there's one more thing that came to mind when you were speaking. I think that there can be a confusion between trust and safety, right? I think there's, and maybe it's a cultural thing as we've had the benefit of a lot of advancements in medicine, but there's, what does safety mean? Safety looks to everybody. At what point do you feel safe enough to jump in? I think to have trust in conversations, you have to accept a degree of risk too. The trust would be, I trust that you'll actually listen to what I'm hearing, or at least try to listen. And if we don't get it right, we'll come back to it or something. But I think where a lot of things get stalled is people are unwilling to move forward for fear of their safety, or they expect a certain amount of, and maybe it's not so much safety, but it's like how much risk, right? There's a risk that when you engage in a conversation, you'll feel misunderstood. There's a risk in the conversation that you won't have an outcome. There's a risk that you'll feel offended, right? But what is the risk we're willing to take in order to engage in these conversations and move forward? And I think one of the reasons I got involved with quality improvement in the first place is I like the notion of like fail forward fast, right? Like go into it, try it, it doesn't work, iterate, do it again. And I think that could be had in conversations too. And at least in my very, very young practice so far, one of the things I try and set the stage with is telling patients, you know, if I'll try and summarize throughout this, if I don't get something right, please jump in, tell me, correct me at any point, and then we'll, you know, carry forward. And maybe that's like an admission of saying, you know, I probably won't be perfect in this, so I don't expect you to either. And then hopefully they're more willing to engage or ask questions that maybe aren't formed or they're embarrassed or something. But it's like, I'm meeting you here. Let's just do our best. Yeah.
I think great summary. I think great outcome focused conversation. I really appreciate how quickly both of you have kind of captured what I had as an idea. I think just to put some more meat to it, essentially what we are talking about is in the work of quality with all its dimensions. What really saying is that there is a gap in chronic disease management, and that gap has been not by design, but by just the way system has evolved. And we are at a stage now that we need to fill that gap. And the gap essentially is, how do you empower the individual to be more involved in their self-management of that chronic disease and feel empowered that they have all the information, and at the same time still have relationships with their care providers. So it's not the issue of breaking those relationships. And I think in our Canadian context, it makes it a little bit more difficult because we are in a very monolithic system, and everything is through a public system. So how do you then create a organization or a capacity to deliver that within that, with respecting that public system? Because if you go to other countries, some of these ideas come and people just go ahead and do them, but they have a different system, whereas we don't have that. So I think this gap should be brought to people so people can have conversations like these, especially in the quality realms, and focus quality in community care as well as in acute care. And then try it, as you say, and then put some evaluation things right up front and try on a smaller scale, try on a smaller population basis. Try in a place, say diabetes, say in city of Surrey, where the prevalence is so high, and then bring maybe 200 people and say 20 doctors and bring it all together, and they become part of this structure, and then see whether you make a difference in that care or not, by having these empowerment, realization, lifestyle, food, diet, support of family, and exercise, and sleep, and all the things which are important for inner and role of mind in this. So that's, I think you get the feel what I'm trying to say here. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think there's so much opportunity now with the virtual platform for us to actually engage in what you're talking about, Dr. Garg. I think we can leverage this cost savings of internet connectedness for people who've spent their lives trying to study certain disease processes like diabetes, like anxiety, major depression, bipolar disorder, hypertension, heart disease, CHF, COPD, asthma, all the usual chronic diseases, to be able to connect with people on a scale of 1 to 200, 1 to 100, and I don't know, I guess just to be kind of active in there. But as you said, the structures have to shift, the incentives have to shift to make that more possible. Right now, when I see that happening, it's usually usually funded by maybe a pharmaceutical situation, but usually very rarely do we involve the patients in the actual discussions. And I think people say, oh, it's about patient privacy. We don't want the patients to have to let people know that they have these particular diseases, so we can't really put them together and then have it under the health authority or have it under a particular physician who's putting all these people together. But under our current British Columbia Medical Services Plan, we actually have the ability to do small group visits. So that's available. It's completely underutilized. Some other examples that come to mind are in our heart function clinic. I know that there are experiments or pilot projects where technicians are equipping patients with wearables to monitor some of their vital signs, and that they'll go home and they'll have a nurse connect with them through the internet to monitor some of their heart failure symptoms or their oxygenation levels and stuff like that. So there's some jump starts, false starts in this concept of really democratizing some of the wisdom or the key pearls that could shift the trajectory of certain chronic diseases. So it's starting, but it's definitely not enough. Yes, Jana.
Oh, sorry, I've got this example that's come to mind, that's really, it jumps off what you're saying. I think it's really an interesting one. It speaks to this idea of that I really feel strongly about as a patient caregiver advocate, and that we're empowering ourselves. Certainly, what would it look like if the system allowed healthcare practitioners to engage in that process, if it was more relationship based, but we're doing it ourselves. And I haven't experienced this myself, but I know there are other advocates who speak from a caregiver perspective who've actually participated in rounds. So they are considered an equal part of the team. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but I know listening to advocates talk about it, I think it's really fascinating that, and this speaks to what we're talking about, this tension in long-term care, that if I, as the essential partner in care or family caregiver or whatever term you want to know, there's a lot of things I know about my loved one in a very integrated, holistic context. And if you allow me to stand here and talk, as you're, assessing and speaking for the status of this patient on a given day, talk about the things that I'm aware of as I sat beside them overnight, or that I'm aware of in the care that I've provided to them over the course of years or decades, how does that change the conversation, and how does it change the care that you're able to provide for them as a healthcare practitioner? I think that one simple concept is revolutionary.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes you wonder why it's not already happening. Especially in long-term care, where the institutional long-term care, right? So again, all these ideas, you cannot be cookie cutter. What works in long-term care contact will be different than diabetes, will be different in mental wellness, will be different. And I think our system has to be nimble enough, because if you try to apply through protocols to everything, same protocol, it won't work, right? And I think that one has to, again, I go back to my notion of integrative thinking. So you define an issue and you try to find a solution which is based on total approach to the system. And in here, we are identifying the gap, and then you do whatever needs to be done.
Another in health, in quality improvement, we often try to look for the bright spots. Like what are some of the positive deviants, those who are kind of outlier high performers? And one thing that comes to mind, there's one of my friends, Brenda Lau, who's also in the Cha-Ching group. She runs the Change Pain Clinic, and in the Change Pain Clinic, they focus a lot on the internal approach. Now that I'm thinking of it, they do a lot of group medical visits. They do online Zoom-based counseling and education sessions. So I think that's a place that I'm going to try to
Absolutely.
study a little bit
Yeah,
more.
absolutely. That's and that's if you look at that, that's a very good example. I didn't think of it to bring it up. If you look at it, that's a very recent phenomenon, and it came because pain management was just not available, and then group of people got together and say, let's start to develop that. And I think I am trying the same thing for diabetes because the need is felt. And I think that pain clinic management or pain management through this approach, I think is a very good example of internal interventions and external intervention brought together in building a capacity. And it's done outside the acute care.
Yeah, and I know that they've had to leverage, private funding in order to do it, which is unfortunate. But
Yeah,
yeah,
that's another issue, right? And but I think having if there is an opportunity under the PC quality group or quality groups like you are part of, to have this conversation, especially with this virtual, you could do it. And like if there were say 10 patients and 10 doctors and having this conversation with a different diverse group of practitioners, just to say, what do you think? And maybe be more specific even, could be a one disease entity, because people like to have a more specificity, right? Yeah. Um, or any other condition, because there might be some models out there already, um, and some academic people to see how academic rigor can be brought to it to make sure that you evaluate and see is it having an impact or not. So that is built in right up front, Um, I keep bringing diabetes because that's where my focus has been given the need. But mental wellness is very big, and the role of mind in this internal intervention. That in itself is a huge, huge topic. And then taking integrative thinking to integrative leadership, to integrative health, to integrative medicine. That means your body, your mind, and your intellect. How do you holistically bring self-management?
I was reminded I had remotely read this article about friendship benches in Zimbabwe, and it was this really amazing. Have any of you heard of them? Yeah, Jana, you have. So basically, in Zimbabwe, they were having the problem because there wasn't enough psychiatrists to cover the region to respond to mental health crises. So they turned to this age-old community resource, grandmothers. And so what they did is they trained like 400 grandmothers in some basic cognitive behavioral therapy or talk therapy, and put these benches around the country. And basically they would sit on them. And if somebody was in a crisis, people could identify these benches and just go and sit down and have a conversation and get some of this like point of care community needs. And I just thought it was just the most remarkable example. And I think they've maybe started to run it out in other countries too. But I thought, you know what, like, do you really need to limit it to mental health? Like, what if somebody's really struggling to change their diet for diabetes? And because, maybe it's coming up to like a holiday season and like the particular type of food is like enriched in their culture. Maybe you have somebody who's already gone through that process and they sit on a, I don't know, blue bench or something like that, or a pink bench, like cotton candy, right? And somebody who's struggling could come up, or there could be something similar in terms of like group
Absolutely.
areas. Like the possibilities are endless.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's cool.
I think that's where social media groups are really phenomenal. I know I experienced that like on a number of different realms. I even think about my daughter's 15 and she was diagnosed with autism not quite 2 years ago. And most of the knowledge that I've acquired as a parent of a child with, high functioning autism has been from parents of children with girls with high functioning autism group. It's incredible what I've gained there. And it's a bit like going to a bench. Yeah, it's, except that there might be 1,500 people on that bench and I just step in there and pose my question and they all chime in. It's pretty amazing. But I've heard of the friendship benches in the school context. Like if you're feeling in school grounds, I think we even have it here in a couple of places in Canada, putting a bench in a school ground, and if a child feels really isolated and alone, they can let people know that that's how they feel by simply sitting on that bench and sort of, I need a friend. And
yeah, interesting. And I think why I thought about that too, because I know there was the mention of privacy, right? Like there's a lot of preoccupation, especially as healthcare professionals, about privacy, but how do we bridge that gap to like this, you know, the external interventions or the community care where you feel supported well in the community? And I think there's something inherent consent, right, to share a conversation by physically going to a space, whether it's virtual or in person.
Yeah, for sure.
Full of a lot of fun ideas now. Now we just have to build the team and build the crew to try to actualize some of these ideas.
Yeah, I think one thing we could do is through this virtual, expand the group a little bit of the conversation, prepare a little bit, and then see what the interest is or what can be achieved or done. You know, even uh, with chronic diseases or with diabetes or whatever. Like your example of pain management is very pertinent. And already a lot of good work is going on there. And I think I like your idea of these group sessions which already exist. Is there something we could do there, you know?
Yeah. The GPSC, the General Practitioner Services Committee under Doctors of BC, they actually fund a program called the Practice Support Program. And their goal is to improve the quality of primary care. And so they actually did some rounds where they actually taught various physicians in various communities on how to do group medical visits, make flyers and invite people at the appropriate time, and then make people feel welcomed to the space, to feel safe, and then to make sure that privacy was there, and then actually how to actually bill for it through the MSP system after. So that technology or that structure is there. It's just underutilized because there's a little extra complexity to it. And we have so many actors within our system, well-meaning health professionals who are a little bit overrun right now. They don't feel like they have much capacity to do extra or to embrace a little bit more complexity. But we need those innovators. We need innovators in this space to be able to shift and evolve our system to something much more sustainable. As you said, Arun, if we don't adapt, we're stuck. We're actually quite behind the ball in terms of creating a sustainable system. And unless we democratize caring health spaces, unless we democratize healing wisdom, we're stuck. Our system in Canada is in trouble.
Absolutely. And I think the other piece is you hear about burnout and you hear about the medical profession burnout and stress. And I think one of the reason people get burned out is because they don't feel valued or they don't feel what they're doing is having an impact. And I think medical practitioners, we have lost some of that inner strength of feeling what I'm doing is making a difference, and especially in chronic diseases. So this could be a avenue for empowering the practitioners themselves, who feel that they have been left out, and they're again reacting to external forces rather than saying what I could do makes sense as a healer, as a provider of health. Obviously you cannot do in everything. As I said before, acute illness, if you got a chest pain, you have to be looked after. That whole machinery which is geared to look after that is there, and people feel pretty good, what they have done. What I'm talking about is the gap in other care where that doesn't exist. And that is 80% of the challenge now.
Thank you.
I wonder too if part of the burnout comes from feeling powerless at implementing your ideas or overwhelmed with the silos and I'll use the word bureaucracy to start. I almost wonder if there would be if it could be valuable to have like a point person more in a bureaucratic role between the like the different health authorities or Doctors of BC, and just say, you know, like almost to have a network of I'll use the word bureaucrats, but a network of administrators who kind of know when a question comes in where they go to. Maybe there's like a submission box. You say, I want to start this project. Who do I talk to? What are the main rules that I have to learn about? And then you submit it. And then all of these people go turn it over, figure it out and say, oh yeah, this one's particularly like this. Let's get these people engaged. And then they come back to them with a summary of recommendations. I think for healthcare providers who are really busy, like something like that, where these strings and silos are broken, like basically identified for them so that they don't then have to identify them. That might be something. I don't know if that already exists. Perhaps it does, but that could be cool. Yeah.
It actually partially exists now through the Specialist Services Committee under Doctors of BC has created facilities engagement. Facilities engagement it puts some money from the ministry and Doctors of BC to fund innovation projects at facilities. So specific to hospitals generally. So community physicians don't really have access to that, but they have their own, if they're a family physician, you know, they'll have the Division of Family Practice will have some innovation funding as well, but it's the process to get through is not very transparent.
Yeah.
But yeah,
is it funding itself, or is it also like supports and navigating what the policies are, or things like that?
Well, the supports would be graduates such as myself of the quality improvement training programs. So I would have to make myself available, and I do, in Sir Memorial I do, in order to kind of coach and analyze and apply a lens of science of improvement for different projects.
Which comes back to how we started off this whole conversation, which was having people at various levels of experience and breadth to connect together to facilitate conversations to ideas to actions.
Yeah.
What does internal intervention mean for the practitioner? I think like what you said most recently, Dr. Garg, has me thinking about that. You know, we talk about external intervention as like the practitioner, you know, to the patient, and the notion of what internal intervention means is still, I think, separates them, but taking that lens or that means of analysis, internal intervention, and apply it to a practitioner in terms of how they are changed when there's community engagement, but also for them as an individual, remembering that practitioners are individuals too, and what does internal intervention mean for them in their own growth, and how does that relate to concepts like burnout? And
internal intervention sounds exciting for me. It sounds like something that would empower me to believe that I have everything I need to incrementally improve my own wellness and my own health, and that there's a community around me who wants me to get better.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I was thinking in coining these terms, you know. So a lot of it comes from my own heritage of how I think. We didn't talk about that in terms of Vedic yogic philosophy of yoga and how yoga forces the mind, but that's where some of the kind of ideas come. But I'm very focused on what we have of the system, not where the ideas are coming from.
Setting the ground fertile to allow for people to step into those healing places when
and I think people are more and more recognizing that with COVID, and I think our relationship to nature or climate and all those things are interdigited in this thinking.
Absolutely. I want to thank you guys so much for your time today. It's been a stimulating conversation, and I do hope that we can continue these ideas. I think they're ideas of new wisdom, ideas of that'll set us out to evolve our system. So really appreciate you, Dr. Garg. And
no, pleasure is mine.
Thank you.
Maybe
Dr.
next
Stephen.
time
we
should include somebody from social media or from other media, because communications are very powerful, and I think we need to see how to go forward. So I think that will be good, you know.
Within the Chechen group, there are multiple the communications directors from Doctors of BC, so maybe they'll figure out something that we can do.
Yeah, yeah. Very good.
Any last closing thoughts from Cirisse or Jana or Dr. Garg?
Real pleasure getting to know you all. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
I just want to thank you, Lawrence, and thank you, Jana and Chris, to take time. This is wonderful exchange of ideas, and hopefully we could take some of this forward.
Absolutely.
Even in our everyday lives, I'm excited about reflecting on this conversation tomorrow and whatever activity I might engage in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Laura.
Be safe.